Could you talk a little bit about how Israel and Judah's kind of existence on maybe the periphery of these big Mesopotamian empires may have influenced or gave rise to some of the texts that we now have in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that much of what the Bible really talks about is this very time of these empires that I mentioned. So there's a lot in 2 Kings about the Assyrians, about the Babylonians, and then in later books you find the Persians and so on. So this is really the environment where the earliest books of the Bible, or the earliest forms of those books, were composed. Anything about earlier history is probably to a significant extent legendary. So there is not a single king, ancient Near Eastern king or Egyptian king, mentioned from the 3rd or 2nd millennium in the Hebrew Bible, perhaps with the exception of Genesis 14, where Amraphel, maybe Hammurabi. I mentioned that because you're the digital Hammurabi. So that's still debated. But if that is the case, then they would have encountered Hammurabi through the later tradition. Hammurabi was a figure not only of history, but also of memory. He continued to play an important role throughout Mesopotamian literary history, so to speak. So I would say, as far as the Assyrian Empire is concerned, it was probably mostly the political impact that empire had that shaped certain books of the Bible, and not so much perhaps at that point the cuneiform texts that were adapted by biblical authors, even though to some extent that may have happened as well. But this is the time sort of between the 8th century and the mid 7th century when both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah really become into the orbit of Assyria. And Israel is eventually, the kingdom of Israel is eventually destroyed by Assyria, and is divided up into provinces, including the province Samaria. The city of Samaria is conquered in 722 and 700 BCE. And that happened, the 720 conquest and the turning of Samaria into a province under the Assyrian king Sargon. And what I believe, and that's not my idea, it was an idea that scholars had early on, among other things, for example, is that there is a sort of mocking dirge about the death of the king of Babel in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 14, which sort of pokes fun at a king, a Mesopotamian king who had tried to conquer the world, but then died on the battlefield without his body being buried. And that song, for example, I would say was most likely written in response to the death of the Assyrian king Sargon in 705, that very king who had actually conquered Samaria. And it's not surprising that biblical authors would have had an interest in depicting that king as someone who had a really bad end, because they were not too fond of this guy for obvious reasons. So they kind of described the end of that king in a somewhat triumphalist way. Sargon did actually die that very death. He did go on a campaign in 705 to the land of Tabal in Anatolia, and on that campaign, the Assyrian military camp was assaulted by the enemy, and as we know from Assyrian cuneiform texts, the body of the king was actually taken away, and it wasn't possible to bury the king, which was really bad because people were very afraid of ghosts of dead people who hadn't been properly buried haunting the living. And with a powerful man like Sargon, the most powerful man of his time, of course, that fear must have been particularly intense. So you have a discourse on that death, even in Assyria itself. And I've pointed out myself that in 705, just about a week before the accession of Sargon's successor, a scholar in the city of Kalho in Assyria copied the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, which deals at the end with death scenarios of various people, and the very last are that someone isn't being properly buried and dies in battle. And I'm sure that this copy of the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic was produced with the fate of Sargon in mind. And in Israel, the reaction was just one very different, of course. In Assyria, it was traumatic. In Israel, in this case, it was sort of good news that this king had died. But it didn't really change the overall trajectory of history, of course, because the Assyrians continued to get back to the Levant and to Israel, and then also to Judah. So in 701, the Assyrian king Sennacherib attacked Jerusalem. He conquered large parts of Judah. He did not actually, and that's important, he did not conquer Jerusalem. And he doesn't claim he did in his own inscriptions. But he imposed a heavy tribute on Hezekiah, the king of Jerusalem at that time, and significantly made his land, the kingdom of Judah, significantly smaller. So here we actually have a case where we can really easily compare the Assyrian report of that campaign against Judah and other places in the Levant with the one in the Bible. And what we find is, on one hand, really quite pronounced parallels. So, for example, one that has been observed ever since these annals were published by the Annals of Sennacherib about this event is that Sennacherib claims in his own inscriptions to have taken a tribute of 30 talents of gold from Hezekiah. And that is exactly the same number that's also mentioned in the Bible. So here we would have a case where the Bible turns out to be historically remarkably accurate. But then there is, of course, the fact that the Bible is not history writing. The Bible has a very clear theological agenda. And so the Assyrian assault in the end is presented in the Bible as a great defeat of Assyria. In the end, the Bible claims the angel of the Lord cut down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, and the Assyrians had to retreat, and Hezekiah is this great heroic king who saves Judah. And that is, of course, not really historically accurate. Probably the Assyrians just didn't come to an end with their assault on Jerusalem because it didn't make sense to invest too many troops and so on. And so they were happy with just having Hezekiah as a vassal king, which he seems to have been ever since then. And so was his son and successor Manasseh. And one famous thing that then might have happened and that had a big impact on biblical theology, and especially on the book of Deuteronomy, was that it seems that the Assyrians would impose loyalty oaths. The Assyrian kings would impose loyalty oaths on regular occasions, especially when a new king would come into office, both on their own subjects within Assyria and on all the elite members of the elites in the vassal states in the provinces all over the place. And fundamentally, these loyalty oaths are recorded in large tablets, which were displayed in temples. Mm-hmm. And what has been observed ever since the first of these loyalty oath tablets were discovered in the 1950s in the Assyrian city of Kalho is that they have interesting parallels with the book of Deuteronomy, especially in the curse section. So these loyalty oaths end with curse sections mentioning the terrible things that will happen when you are not loyal to the Assyrian king. And there's one sequence where they first refer to, I don't remember it exactly, I think Shamash taking away your eyesight, and then Sin giving you ulcers, skin disease, and then eventually Ishtar, the goddess of love, prompting your wife to lie in the lap of another man. And exactly the same curses, but of course without these deities mentioned, because in the Bible everything of course becomes monotheistic, are mentioned in the same sequence also in the curse section of the book of Deuteronomy. And then of course you have the kind of, well, if you wish, loyalty oaths. But what is striking about the book of Deuteronomy, of course, is the fact that the loyalty oaths there are not to the Assyrian king, they are to God. So your loyalty in Deuteronomy is supposed to be given to God. But otherwise, for example, there's a passage about prophets and dream interpreters possibly not being loyal either to the king in the Assyrian version or to God in the biblical version. And it's very similar in both cases. So it looks like that possibly after the Assyrian power had eventually in the second half of the 7th century BCE become less pronounced, that these loyalty oaths, which most likely the Judeans in Jerusalem also had to swear, and tablets would have existed possibly in Aramaic translations, were used by priests and scholars in Jerusalem to create a completely new text, namely the earliest version of Deuteronomy, which was then reprojected to the time of Moses, much earlier times. But there is, in 2 Kings 22, there is a passage where Hilkiah, the high priest of the Judean king Josiah, finds an old book of the law, and then starts to unify the cult. Everything has to be in Jerusalem, and only one God can be worshipped. This is very much in line with Deuteronomy. And it would seem as though, and that has been argued already in the beginning of the 19th century, that what's described here is actually the discovery of Deuteronomy. And what many now believe is that there was no real discovery. It was an attempt of creating a tradition. The book was newly produced at that time, but of course it had to be divinely inspired. Therefore, it was reprojected into the earliest times, and therefore there had to be a story about this book having been found in this later context. So that would be an example of this adaptation of Mesopotamian ideology, in this case royal ideology, but for a very different purpose. And some Hebrew Bible scholars have actually pointed out that, if you wish, this is an act of democratization. It's anti-royal. And it really is. When you read these passages in Deuteronomy, what you find is that, for example, it says that the Israelites can have a king, okay, but if they have a king, then that king cannot have too many horses and too many women. So all those perks that come with kingship, whether it's a harem or whether it's a large army, are essentially said to be bad. So it's really a kind of theological transformation that's going on here. And you can only understand that actually when you see the book of Deuteronomy in this very context. So that's one reason why I think, even for those who consider the Hebrew Bible for themselves an authoritative text, will profit actually from looking at these contexts. This is more impressive in a way to see it in what happens here. It's really a rather revolutionary event you can observe here, than when you are totally ignorant of this kind of historical context.